And so, as you can see, we're on lecture number 6, the final lecture. The last day of our retreat then has been dedicated to the notion of the Ascension project. And I've been looking at it in 3 different ways. Firstly, I wanted to look at the journey of an individual soul in one incarnation, and that's what I covered this morning. In the afternoon session, I want to look at, the journey of a single soul throughout multiple incarnations. And then in section 2 of today's lecture, I want to look at the Ascension project as it affects the entire cosmos, all of God's creation. So that's where we'll be going in this final lecture. Section 1, the individual over many lifetimes, and section 2, the journey of the cosmos itself. So you remember this morning, I talked about the possibility of there being, a multi-stage evolutionary model of ascension. And I stopped at sacrament number 20, which was the sacrament of death. And I explained in answer to, I don't know if it was Sharon who asked the question, when I said I didn't believe in life after death, it's because I don't believe in death, in the sense that I don't think that life begins at conception and ends with the shuffling off of the spacesuit. I believe that life begins, when God self-fractalizes and only ends when all souls are gathered back to source. So life is a single journey from God's womb to God's heart. So in that sense, for me, there is no afterlife because there's no death to begin with. But the 20th sacrament this morning was the notion of death when we shuffle off this mortal coil. But I believe that there are 3 more sacraments in the evolutionary trajectory, of an individual soul. And sacrament number 21, I'm going to call the Bodhisattva vow. And it's beyond, egocentric, it's beyond ethnocentric, it's beyond even world-centric, it's actually cosmocentric. And so it's the vow that these great bodhisattvas make, that they will not merge with source until all sentient beings have awakened. Well, I think that's sacrament number 21. And it's there for all of us, to receive. Sacrament number 22 then, as a result of that vow, is reincarnation, the decision to keep coming back. Even if you feel like you've learned all the lessons you need to learn, your soul has at least, but that there's lots of other people who are still asleep at the wheel, and you've come back to kind of wake up the rest of us. And in reincarnation, at that stage, forgetting is merely a kind of a cryptamnesia. There's a notion in psychology called cryptamnesia, which is you think you're discovering something for the very first time. But what actually happened is you learned it much earlier, but you forgot you knew it. And now you're remembering it again, but you think you're learning it or kind of experiencing it for the first time. But you're not actually experiencing it. You've experienced this many times before. So for instance, there's the notion of cryptamnesia with language. So that, for instance, if you were raised with a language for the first 3 or 4 years, and then your family moved completely, and you never learned that language again, and you never use that language again, and now in your 40s, you come across a speaker of that language, and you suddenly realize, my God, I know what this person is saying. So it's not that you're learning the language for the first time, it's that you learned it and you forgot it, and now it's coming back to you. So that's what cryptamnesia means. And reincarnation at that stage of our journey is literally cryptamnesia. You've forgotten that you knew, but now you're hitting the ground running. And in subsequent incarnations, you're waking up a lot faster than you did in previous incarnations. So that would be, I would call it sacrament number 22. And then the sacrament number 23 is the game is over. According to Hinduism, it's called Laila, the game that God plays. I call it playing hide and go seek with herself. And that's over. And now all souls are gathered once more into source. So that's the entire cycle. That's what I mean when I say that all of the evolutionary trajectory is a movement from God's womb to God's breast. And in the case of our cosmos, that's now 14 billion years into its safari, and it's not over yet. So that's what I mean then by the last 3 sacraments. And this is where you get many, many lifetimes to kind of complete that trajectory. So I want to look then at what I'm going to call the secular face of ascension. I believe that culture is the personality of a community. So in the same way that, every individual person has a personality, which is the sum total of their, interface with life and how they respond to it. So a community has its own personality, its own ethos, and culture is that personality. And culture contains many yardsticks of evolution. How do you judge the evolutionary trajectory of an entire culture? There have to be some kinds of metrics or some kinds of yardsticks in order to estimate where it's going. So one very easy metric, I believe, I look at to determine how far a culture has advanced in its trajectory of ascension is to look at how we assign personhood, to whom and to what we assign personhood. And when you look at the history of our species, Homo sapiens sapiens, initially personhood was only meant the male rulers, literally. There were no people, nobody had personhood except the male leaders, the monarchs, or the kind of the top echelon. They were the only ones who had actually person, who were regarded as being people or had personhood. At some stage in our evolution, non-ruling class males were inducted into personhood. Now, Joe Smith on the street, as long as he was a male, was regarded as a person. So that's a movement in the trajectory. Finally, all males are regarded as persons. It took a long time before women were actually regarded as persons. Before that, they were just chattels. They were belonging to real persons, the males. It took a long time for children to have rights and to be regarded as literally having personhood. At some stage then, we actually assigned personhood to other races and indigenous tribes. And that took a long time. So for instance, in South Africa, the Bushmen of the Kalahari were not regarded as human beings. They did not have personhood. The last, permit issued by the South African government was in 1936, the last permit to hunt Bushmen, literally. So there was a permit if you wanted to hunt bear, or a permit to hunt lions, or a permit to hunt antelope, and there was a permit to hunt Bushmen, because there weren't people. That was 1936. That's how recent it was, that we've actually assigned personhood to human beings. So what will that metric look like in the future? Who will become a person in the future who's not regarded as a person right now? Because that's a metric of how we're evolving as a species. So for instance, at what stage of the pregnancy will the unborn child be regarded as a person? And if that's the case, what do you think of recent legislation that's been enacted in our country, which gives a woman the right to terminate the pregnancy, not even before the delivery, but after the delivery? What does that say about the notion of personhood in our times? When will we evolve far enough to confer personhood on animals? I mean, the interesting thing is we've already done with corporations. Way back in the 1800s, we conferred personhood on corporations. They're regarded under American law as having personhood. And certainly with recent legislation in our own country, we give them permission to vote. Corporations vote by putting gigantic sums of money into the lobbying process for particular candidates. So we've conferred personhood on corporations a long time ago. When are we going to confer it on animals? And for instance, will there come a time in our evolution when we'll confer personhood and the rights attendant upon personhood on our forests, on our rivers, on our mountains? Will these have, legal rights? Because that will be a metric of just how much we've evolved as a species and as a cosmos. So that's section B. That's what I mean by the secular face of ascension. What about the spiritual face of ascension? Here, very quickly, I'm just going to run through 4 different visions I've had over the years, and I've shared these visions with you on a few occasions. The first vision was a vision of Gaia volunteering to God to inhabit and to animate a particular rock, the third rock from the sun in a particular solar system, and to volunteer to throw up life until she bred a species which would be aware of its own divinity and the divinity of all the other life forms with which it shared the planet. And we're on the edge of that breakthrough, if we handle ourselves correctly. That was the first vision, maybe 30 years ago. After that, I had a vision of a pregnant planet Earth. And in this vision, I could see the silhouette of a mother. I could see her pregnant belly, watching her in silhouette. And I can actually see into her womb, and I can see, what's being conceived and what's being carried in the womb. And instead of there being a single umbilical cord connecting what's in the womb with the mother, there were 7 billion different umbilical cords connecting what was in the womb with the mother. And at various stages, I noticed that the health of the mother seemed to wax and to wane. At some stages, she was really, really vibrant and alive. And some stages, she was really subject to lassitude and energyless. And I realized that I could see liquid flowing through these umbilical cords, all 7 billion of them. And I realized that at some stages, this liquid is crystalline and clear and bright. And at some stages, it's gunky, and thick. And when it was bright, the mother was alive and active, and when it was gunky, she was without energy. And what I was told in that vision was that that liquid represented the thoughts and the words and the behavior of all 7 billion people on planet Earth right now. That planet Earth was carrying us in her womb, and we were influencing her health by how we thought and how we spoke and how we acted. And when there was a preponderance of bright, loving thoughts and words and actions, she was alive and vibrant. And when there was a preponderance of anger and warfare, either our thoughts or our words or actions, she was close to death. So that was a second vision of the Earth. The third vision was a vision in which I saw the planet surrounded. There was a grid pattern that all the lines of longitude and all the lines of latitude where they intersected, and at the two poles were stationed beings of light, angelic presences. And the message was that we are not alone in our struggle for ascension, that there are these light beings. And when I estimated it subsequently, it meant 64,442. But that's just a symbolic number. There are a lot more than that. A lot more light beings who are, protecting us and trying to mentor us and guard us through the process of this Ascension project. It was a third one. And then just very recently, and I mentioned this in a homily, on Holy Thursday just gone by, literally just a few weeks ago, I had this vision where I'm walking around here where I live on the pathway, and all of a sudden I'm elevated about a mile above the planet. And I have this vision, but I'm not in Healdsburg where I live. I'm on this extraordinarily beautiful sandy beach, this huge, huge big beach. And there are hundreds of thousands of human beings on this beach. And they're kind of just walking around fairly aimlessly. And then all of a sudden, some kind of a master choreographer begins to try to bring these people into a particular configuration. And I noticed then that, which I hadn't noticed before, that each of these human beings on the beach is carrying a kind of like a sombrero, a hat, but they're not wearing it yet. But on a particular note, everybody puts on this sombrero. So I'm looking like at the pixels on the beach from a mile high. And they're of different colors. So some of them are blue sombreros, and some of them are green. And some of them are black, and some of them are white. So as this master choreographer, through some kind of musical intervention, is organizing all of the people, they band themselves in such a way that when they're together now, there are two hemispheres, two complete circles, side by side. And when they put on their hats, the guys who put on the hats which are green represent the land masses of our planet. And those who were putting on the blue hats represented the oceans of our planet. And it was a perfect picture of the two hemispheres in which we live. There was North and South America. There was Antarctica. There was the Arctic. There was Europe. There was Eurasia. There was Africa. And so the entire planet is represented in blue or green, in a perfect, cartography of the planet. And then underneath there was this long rectangular kind of a box in which there were rows, and columns of people standing. And when they put on their hats, they were either black hats or white hats. And when that happened on the signal, they spelt out the phrase, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." So the black hats represented the ink, and the white hats represented the spaces between the letters and between the words. But there's this perfect representation of planet Earth and this phrase, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." And so I believe that is part of the trajectory, the evolutionary trajectory into in the ascension process. I want to share now a vision that Jesus had, which is called the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes was his articulation of the vision he had. And to fully understand the Beatitudes, we have to understand that I think it's a love song. It's a mantra in a style of Hebrew poetry, which is called Semitic parallelism, where you come back to the same idea again and again and again, using slightly different words, to convey the same message. So, for instance, in some of the Psalms, the poetical Psalms, you get this notion, that somebody has fallen in love with the law of God and the precepts of God and the instructions of God. So precepts and laws and instructions, it's a kind of a Semitic parallelism where you're using different words to convey the same message. And so for me, when I listen to the Beatitudes, it's like this love song, it's like this mantra in Semitic parallelism. And there are 8 of them. But I think the one that really is the most dangerous of all of them, it's not blessed are the peacemakers or blessed are the merciful. The one that's the most dangerous is the one that says, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." That's a very, very dangerous statement. And you can watch what Herod's reaction to the same sentiment was when the Magi came to him, telling him that they were searching for the new king of Israel. And Herod's reaction was, I'm going to have to eliminate this guy. And so the idea of a little newborn infant somehow representing the overthrow of Herod's regime, was too much. So there's this little baby infant who threatened to overthrow the entire monarchy of Herod. And so you get the very same thing if you really accept this mantra of that particular evocation. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Was Jesus being serious about that? And when you look at Homo sociopathicus as distinct from Homo spiritualis, very possibly Homo sociopathicus regards this meekness as a cloak for a power grab. And so this notion, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Any one of the oligarchy who's into control of planet Earth is going to be really, really frightened by that statement if they understood what it was. Because what they're going to see is that it literally is a cloak. They're going to regard it as a cloak for a power grab. But what it is actually is the kind of the blueprint for what I've called Homo spiritualis. And it's very interesting that in some senses, the Jesus movement is actually creating a whole new breed of human beings. And this is very powerfully rendered in some of the Gnostic Gospels where they use this phrase, true human beings. So what does that phrase mean, true human beings? What does it mean to be a true human being as distinct from a human being? And the difference is the difference between Homo sapiens sapiens and Homo spiritualis. And certainly it represents a huge difference between Homo sociopathicus and Homo spiritualis. And so the entire point of the Jesus movement was to breed a new species of true human beings. And so that phrase in the Beatitudes is really, really dangerous. If the powers that be understood the true significance of that, they'd be quaking in their boots, just like Herod was when he heard about the infant Jesus being born in Bethlehem. I predict then in our future that a time will come when the Sermon on the Mount will actually reflect human behavior at an intrapsychic level, at an interpersonal level, at an intercommunal level, at an international level, and an interspecial level. That mantra will be how we will live into the future. until that time, is fully among us, then the Beatitudes, this love song, needs to be sung again and again and again, in the same way that a mother sings a lullaby again and again and again to a fever-ridden infant, because that's where we are right now in our progress. And so I believe that was the vision of Jesus, which he articulated in the Sermon on the Mount. Part of our journey then is to contend with our own shadow material. So the next section, I want to talk about the idea of original sin. And I'm going to deal with it in three different ways. I'm going to talk about the biblical version that we find in Genesis chapter 3. And then I'm going to talk about the version of Augustine from the 400s. And then I want to talk about a model of my own, what I think it really was. So to begin with the Genesis model, where you're looking at this creation myth and the notion of the fall. And what we have to understand is that most modern people don't understand the significance of myth. To say something is a myth, or to talk about mythology or folklore, is to pretend like it's a kind of a simplistic understanding by a pre-rational or pre-scientific tribe of people. And it's not at all. It's not that at all. It is the archived wisdom which is represented by and which is kind of passed on through storytelling. So stories are a particular way of archiving wisdom and passing on that wisdom to other generations. So you look at the people who created these Bible stories. And as I said this morning, that process began in Israel, in Judah at least, the southern kingdom of Judah, about the year 950 BCE. And then started in the northern kingdom of Israel about 750 BCE. And they come up with all these great myths, but they're living at a time in human history when women give birth with a whole lot of pain. How do you explain that? Where farmers are trying to kind of wrestle crops from nature, particularly nomadic people who have recently just settled down to an agricultural lifestyle in which they had no competence much. How do you explain how they deal with their agricultural issues? How do you deal with the reality of patriarchy? Because you're living in patriarchal times. Very simply, how do you deal with the fear of snakes? And in one extraordinary story, the storyteller manages to give answers to all of those four issues. This storyteller is an amazing character. And he's telling stories to try to make sense of the experiences of ordinary people. Childbirth, agriculture, patriarchy, snakes. How do you make sense of all of that in a story form? So how do you build wisdom into that? And he does it in an extraordinarily beautiful story. And if all we do with the story is to say, that's a ridiculous story, doesn't make any kind of scientific sense, we haven't understood what the objective was. The objective was to make sense of their very real experiences and to come up with some kinds of answers that would help them to understand that. Now, when we receive the patrimony of a mythology, our job is not to dismiss it, as being the literal utterings of primitive pre-scientific thinking. It's rather to realize that kids grow up, civilizations grow up, and therefore the folk tales and the fairy tales and mythology, they have to be re-engineered and they have to be reinterpreted for our times. They're evergreen when you know how to dig into them. There are layers and layers and layers of wisdom in it, far below the kind of the literal meaning of it. And each generation and each era of human beings will unpack it according to the world in which they live in order to make sense of the world in which they live. And so we can go back to those same stories, whether they're the stories of the Bible or the story Irish folklore or African mythology. It doesn't really matter. It's all the revealed word of God when we understand what revelation really means, which is archived wisdom hidden in story form to be unpacked for different eras by different mindsets at different times. And so you take the story then of the Garden of Eden and original sin in the Garden of Eden. And, to the people of 950 BCE, that may have represented a belief that this was actually a historical event, but it represented a deep inner wisdom, but it may have been interpreted by them in a literal fashion. So do I believe at this stage, for instance, that God a kind of a very anthropomorphic God who walked in the cool of the evening in the Garden of Eden and was looking out for Adam and Eve, who were now hiding because they had discovered they were naked after eating the fruit of the tree that they weren't supposed to eat from. That this kind of, emotional God kicked this pre-rational couple out of the Garden of Eden and closed the gates and said, you can never come in here again. I obviously don't. But that's the story that's being told. And so what does it represent? It represents actually not the eating of a piece of fruit. It represents the gradual exercise of free will in the employ of either service to self or service to other. So eating of the forbidden fruit and leaving the Garden of Eden is about, either abandoning our alignment with God because we now have free will and we can choose to act really, really selfishly, or aligning ourselves with God, in which case we've never been thrown out of the Garden of Eden because we're in service of others and in service of the Ascension project. So in one sense then, original sin and karma are twins that were born at the same time. They're identical twins in a sense. It's the beginning of our journey of ascension. And so it's the misalignment with the gift of free will that creates all kinds of criminal activity, including the very first murder. Very first murder, when Cain killed Abel, he literally, if you believe the story literally, he wiped out 25% of the human race. There was only 4 people on the planet: Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. And if Cain killed Abel, he reduced the population of the world by 25%. Now, is that a literal story? Probably not. But there obviously was a first murder of some kind. And so, in some senses, it's the template or the story that explains how criminal activity, and particular fratricide or murder in general, got started. So that would be kind of my unpacking of the Genesis account of original sin. The second version then would be the version created by Augustine, who flourished about the year 400. And the background to the story is this. Augustine is living in Carthage in North Africa originally, but he's a Roman citizen. And he lives a very promiscuous lifestyle. He actually has a child out of wedlock. And then he encounters Christianity, and he becomes a real devotee of Christianity and becomes one of its chief spokespersons. Subsequently, throughout history, he's probably one of the top 4 or 5 theologians who've had the most influence on the evolution of Christianity. So he lived at a time when the Roman Empire is under siege from the Celtic tribes of Northern Europe, the Vandals and the Huns, and they've sacked Rome on a few occasions. Now, Augustine, as a Roman citizen, believed that Rome was the quintessential, organization with divinely blessed, because it was completely rational, really well formed, a tremendous bureaucracy. Everything ran really, really well. There were roadways being built, and there was the Pax Romana. The other tribes weren't allowed to fight with each other. Only the Romans were allowed to kill people. And so irrational behavior meant that you were ungodlike. Rational behavior meant that you were really godlike. Now, he came to the conclusion that when a man and a woman are making love, at the moment of orgasm, they are totally out of control. They are totally irrational at that moment. And therefore, they are totally ungodlike in that action. And it's precisely at that moment that they conceive the child. And therefore, the child is conceived at a moment when the parents are most ungodlike. And so the child is now stuck with what Augustine would call original sin. That was his thinking, that was his background. And according to Augustine, there were 3 consequences to original sin. The first one is that our will is weakened. And indeed, he's making up a story just like Genesis did. Our will definitely is weakened. We're all addicted to things which are bad for us. Whether it's alcohol or relationship or whatever it is, every one of us has some kind of an addiction because our will is weakened. We continue to do stuff that we know is bad for us. We continue to eat French fries and hamburgers instead of, salads. And I'm totally guilty on that one. And so, I've been doing that for most of 70 years, even though I knew it was really bad for me, but I'm addicted. to chocolate or, French fries. And so our will definitely is weakened. That's the first consequence. The second consequence is that our intellect is darkened. We can't really see things as they are. And obviously that's true as well. We only see appearances. And so neither science nor psychology can even define what consciousness is. That's how intellectually impaired we are. We cannot even define what consciousness is. Science calls it the difficult question. And psychology was so upset with it that eventually it threw out of it. Even though psychology is the study of the soul, behavioral psychology believes there is no such thing as consciousness. It doesn't exist. We're just black boxes that can be programmed by behavior, by reward or punishment. So they didn't even, it was so difficult to understand consciousness, they claimed that consciousness didn't even exist. And scientism claims it doesn't exist. Consciousness is simply an illusion created by neuronal and biochemical activity in a physical brain. That's how dumb the intellect of the human being is. And the third consequence, Augustine said, is that our body gets sick and eventually dies. And he's absolutely right there. In the 70,000 years since the arrival of Homo sapiens sapiens, statistically you can kind of infer that there have been 111 billion human beings who have lived on planet Earth in that period of time. And of those 111 billion, 104 billion have died. And things ain't looking so good for the rest of us. So nobody gets off this planet alive. So he was right. It all ends with death. Is if you believe that death actually is the end of life, which I don't. But in the Augustinian model, that was it. So there was Augustine's version of original sin. It's the causes for it and the consequences of it. When I looked then at, I have my own theory of original sin. So I unpacked the Genesis account towards the end with my own thinking, and I'm going to create a model of my own. I think that the idea of original sin is actually, it's like a Celtic knot again. It's three strands interwoven with each other. And so here I want to kind of hack Wordsworth, who said, trailing clouds of glory do we come from God who is our home. Now I want to tweak that a little bit and say, trailing clouds of karma do we come from God who is our home. And I want to emphasize again and again and again that karma is not all bad. Karma is just the consequence of all the decisions that have been made in the past. Some really good stuff has happened and some really horrendous stuff has happened. So the first strand is personal karma. The journey my soul has taken throughout all of its incarnations and the decisions it made, the thoughts it had, the words it spoke, the actions it engaged in. I am the heir to all of those thoughts and words and actions. So there's a personal strand to this Celtic knot. There's a planetary strand to it. As I said this morning, I made the claim that human beings are responsible for all of the karma generated by all of the agents on planet Earth throughout 3.7 billion years of life on planet Earth. So that would be kind of planetary karma, that we're dealing with all of the decisions, thoughts, words, and actions of all of the critters that have ever inhabited planet Earth. And the third strand in this Celtic knot is that even in our own physical bodies, the physical body that you inhabit right now has evolved from non-human ancestry. And throughout that entire that evolutionary trajectory, all the ways from plant life right down to Homo sapiens sapiens right now, there have been predators and prey. There have been violent acts committed. Even plants do that. You can go, for instance, to the plant called the Venus flytrap. And it's this beautiful flower that opens up, attracting flies, and the fly comes in order to taste it, and it snaps shut, and it literally eats the fly. It literally dismembers the fly. So even plants do that. I said to you that where I live up here, there's a plant called Scots broom. And Scots broom it is not a native species to California, but it's invading California. And it's literally, in the 25 years I've lived up here, it's been progressively marching up along Chemise and along Shane Way where I live. And it's a big issue for me every year to try and weed it out, because it's killing the opportunity for native plants to flourish. So even at the level of plant life, there's predator prey and there's murder. and taking place. And we inhabit physical bodies that are the kind of the end point so far of that process. So actually, we're inhabiting bodies, where that's built in to the system. And we call it, in some ways, we call it the reptilian brain, the hind brain, the fight or flight. So for me, they are the three strands. And when we want to think about original sin, for me, that's what it involves. That every little baby who comes on the planet Earth has to work with that configuration. Now, I believe that every little baby volunteered to be here, but they have to work with that configuration. And so the original sin is that is the original environment that the child encounters. So it's only original in the sense that it's what they experience from the moment that they're born again. But it's not original in the sense that it's been caused by a sin, of the sin of copulation. I don't believe that that's true. So that's what I want to say then. That for me is kind of the end point of the trajectory of a single soul over many, many incarnations. So that was section 1, this 6th lecture. I want to see how we're doing for time. Again, I'm going to have to move more quickly through the stuff, unfortunately. So now the ascension of the cosmos itself. So this is the journey that the entire, of creation. And as I said this morning, everything is a fractal of source, including the cosmos itself, including planet Earth. It's a fractal of source. And so evolution is impacting every level of the fractal, from the individual to the family, to the planet, to the solar system, to the cosmos, to all of creation. And as representative of, that entire trajectory of the entire picture, I'm going to focus just on one part of the fractal of humanity, or the human species itself, as representative of the journey of the entire universe. And so human evolution allegedly began about 13.8 billion years ago with the Big Bang. That somehow that was the beginning of the entire universe. That was the kind of the birth, of the entire universe. Hominids arrived on the scene only very, very recently. In that 13.8 billion year trajectory, hominids arrived about 6 million years ago. And modern humans arrive, anatomically modern humans arrive only about 195,000 years ago. And Homo sapiens sapiens arrives only about 70,000 years ago. So in the history of the universe, literally humans came on the scene about 3 seconds to midnight. If you regard the entire evolutionary trajectory and history of the cosmos as a 24-hour clock, humans arrived literally about 3 seconds to midnight. That's how long we've been here. But in this entire, 14 billion year trajectory, why in God's name would we imagine that the evolutionary, trajectory ends with us? That God has nothing more to do, or God can't think of any further stage of evolution than Homo sapiens sapiens. It's extraordinary anthropomorphic hubris to think that we are the culmination and the end point of that process. So the invitation for us then is, having gone from egocentricity to ethnocentricity to world-centric thinking, is to go into cosmocentric thinking, to think as denizens of the cosmos. And so we look at our own planet as a fractal inviting us to make that journey. I said recently in a homily that I believe that the planet itself, is moving through 7 different phases, just like the individual human goes from a physical body to an etheric body, to an astral body, to a mental body, to a psychic body, to a soul body, to cosmic consciousness or God itself. I believe that the planet too is on that trajectory as a fractal of the cosmos and as a fractal of source. And so it starts off as a physiosphere, just a rock, the 3rd rock from the sun. And then it's animated by Gaia. And so in some senses, it throws up an atmosphere. An atmosphere for me represents the fact that Gaia has become sexually mature. She's now capable of creating life. But to do that, to get to that place, there needed to be an atmosphere created that would sustain life. So in some senses, stage 2 is an atmosphere, and that is where Gaia is now sexually mature. Now she can conceive, which leads then to the 3rd stage, the biosphere. the sheath of life surrounding this rock, guarded by this atmosphere, which is the womb. And so we're going to get plant life and animal life and human life making up the biosphere. The fourth stage of that process, with Teilhard de Chardin, called the noosphere. It is the sheath of consciousness that surrounds our planet. When we become thinking beings, and particularly when we create stuff like the internet or the World Wide Web, in which, you know, the entire planet is talking to itself. That each neuron, each person, each plant is in communication with every other one. So that would be the stage 4 of the Bodies of Gaia. Stage 5 I call the anima sphere. So it is the realization that there's a soul to this process, and theology is an attempt to understand that stage of the development. There's a 6th stage I call the pneuma sphere, the spirit sphere, and it is where mysticism develops. And that's kind of the next stage as we move back in the evolution trajectory. And then finally, what I call the Brahma sphere, or the cosmosphere, where we literally reunite with God. And so that's a fractal of the ascension process, where literally planet Earth itself is a demonstration of what's happening even at a cosmic level. Which brings me then very quickly, I want to have a very quick look at what I'm going to call the cosmic laws. And I've identified 11 of them, so I'm going to run through them really, really quickly. The first cosmic law, I believe, is the law of love. And it's the realization that science and mysticism are two hands, and one cannot contradict the other. One of them washes the other. They're the hands of God. Both of them are the hands of God. One of them is the mind of God, and the other is the soul, or the heart of God, embracing us. And so the law of love is the realization that true science and true mysticism could never be enemies. They're hands from the same source. So the law of love is the realization that all true knowledge and all true wisdom is coming from the same source. And the entire purpose then of incarnation is to remember these cosmic laws even in the process of incarnation when we're away from home. The second law I would call the law of unity, that everything actually is wrapped up and entangled, to use the phrase from the Irish physicist John Bell. And I've used this phrase many, many times with you. The law of unity for me, my own articulation of it, is that life is a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that source is having. So there is only, there is only God. And when we have this understanding, then all war is civil war, and all violence is an autoimmune disease. There is no other. When you fight with the divinity within yourself, or at least you don't recognize the divinity within yourself, and so you fight with the illusion of the separate physical entity with whom you have an issue. So that's the law of unity, as I understand it. The third law I would call the law of manifestation. And the Buddha put it very powerfully one time when he said, form is emptiness and emptiness is form. The Celtic rendition of this is that it is the darkness that gives birth to the light. It is not the darkness that swallows up the light. It is the darkness that gives birth to the light. And then the light illuminates the darkness. And so it's the Tao, the yin and the yang, illuminating, and helping each other. And so in some senses then, the Celts got that, Thich Nhat Hanh got it when he said, when you look at a flower consists completely of non-flower elements. If you took a flower and took away the water, and took away the minerals, and took away the sunshine, and took away the wind, you wouldn't have a flower. And so a flower consists completely of non-flower elements, which is the law of manifestation and the law of unity wrapped up into one. And then you have the Aborigines of Australia saying that the entire world in which we live is actually a song that was sung by the ancestors. So the world is the physicalization of the music of the ancestors. They're all onto the same idea. Law number 4 is the law of impermanence. And this appears to be a really devastating thing, that everything that is born will die. But what we don't say, there's a flip side to that. Everything that dies will resurrect. Everything that lives will die, but everything that dies will resurrect, because there isn't a final death. There's only the darkness of the womb and the light to which it gives birth. That's what's happening. And so again and again and again, what you find is that apparent death is simply the reconfiguration of the pieces to create more and more complex life forms. Ilya Prigogine said that and won a Nobel Prize for it with something called dissipative structures. Hinduism realized that with the notion of Shiva. Shiva is the destructive aspect of God. Not that God destroys everything, but that God recombines the elements, as you would with a jigsaw puzzle which isn't working out properly. So it's like literally just taking the letters of the alphabet and recombining them. All of the works of Shakespeare consist simply of 26 symbols that he reorganized again and again and again and again and again. All music consists of 7 chords, which are mixed in various combinations. The nucleotides, every single life form on planet Earth is simply a different combination and sequencing of 4 nucleotides, A, G, C, and T. Everything that you look around you is simply the combination of these 4 nucleotides. But you have to kind of disassemble them and recombine them. And so the law of impermanence is the law not just of death, it's the law of reconfiguration. Everything that dies rises again. And we think that impermanence is, holy God, there's going to be an end to this. What am I going to do? Number 5 is the law of entanglement. All of manifestation, all of creation is in dialogue. It's all entangled. So everything that exists in some senses is a neuron on the brain of God, or the cosmic brain. And so some of these cells in this brain are on the other side of the veil. And we call them the dearly departed, or the angels. We have different terms for them, or the saints, or the avatars. They're simply cells in the brain, at a different side of the veil. And so in some senses, we are the way in which God talks to herself during incarnation. That, very simply put, is the mission of incarnation. We, and by incarnation I don't mean just human beings, I mean the oak trees, I mean banana slugs. Everything that exists is simply the way in which God speaks to herself during incarnation. That would be that 5th law. The 6th law, I would call it the law of interdimensional communication. And so there's a dialogue going on, not just between these life forms and God, but among these life forms as well. And so here's a very partial list of that dialogue and the methods of communication. I'm going to just list them off. I don't have time to go into them. Intuition, inspiration, déjà vu, synchronicity, moments of awe, memorable dreams, visions, meditation, time spent in nature, psychic moments, brushes with death, and significant illnesses. All of those are ways in which this entire configuration is in dialogue with itself and ultimately in dialogue with God. Law number 7, the law of attraction. Frequencies tend to amplify each other or destroy each other. If you impose 2 sine waves on each other, depending on whether they're in complete harmony with each other or totally out of phase with each other, you get 2 results. If they're in complete harmony, then you double the amplitude of the wave. Literally, the wave is twice as high as it was if they're in complete synchrony. If they're completely out of phase with each other, they cancel each other out and you got a flat line. That's what's happened. Now, I'm saying that because we're going to attract into our life, the frequencies we emit. And if we're emitting frequencies of anger and fear and unforgiveness and despair, that is the frequency we're going to attract into our personal lives, into our community lives, into our national life, and into our planetary life. If we're in a kind of a wave and a frequency of love and compassion and forgiveness and understanding, that is what we will attract into our personal lives, into our families, into our nations, and into our planet. And so it becomes really, really important to monitor. Christ says, you shall be held accountable for every idle word. He's not saying that God is keeping tabs and writing down in a book, oh, he said a 4-letter word, bad boy, or he stole something, bad girl. It's not about that. It is that it's our thoughts that create the tulpas that influence the subsequent trajectory of our lifetimes. Number 8, the law of deliberate intention. We can live either at a conscious or non-conscious level, and in some sense it doesn't matter because we're still creating karma. we're still creating outcomes. But there's a big, big difference. When we're sending out deliberate intentions, we are masters of our destiny. When we're making decisions at an unconscious level, we are victims of our destiny. And so Christ will say, the kingdom of God is, to use a Greek phrase, en masoi, which means within you and among you. So we're always creating. Even when we're sleeping, we're creating. And most of the time, most of us are creating through unconscious decision making. And to that extent, we are then victims of our own processes. And to the extent that we bring that to full awareness, we are masters of our own destiny. And this is the great object of meditation, and particularly Vipassana meditation within Buddhism. Number 9, the law of allowing. That you have to allow other people the same latitude that you allow yourself. If you're going to exercise free will and make the mistakes that you're going to make and learn from the mistakes you're going to make, you have to allow other people to do the very same thing. There can't be one law for me and a different law for other people. And that's a huge concern I have right now. I see in our country right now and in our world right now, a whole kind of new censorship, where it is not okay to think differently or to articulate different perspectives. People are being deplatformed. They don't have an outlet anymore. There's no dialogue taking place because there is only one way of looking at any phenomenon, and some oligarchy is going to decide for us what that is, and they're not open to hearing any other perspective on this issue. So the law of allowing is really important in our time. Law number 10, the law of karma, and I've dealt with that already at length in this topic in today's lecture. The final law, the law of deferred outcome. For fully enlightened being, there's no deferral, there's no time lag between a thought and its manifestation. To think a thought is to manifest it immediately. And we actually, the training wheels for that process, we use at night when we're dreaming. Because when we dream, the thought immediately articulates itself in an outcome. We create, a plot. We create characters, a location, costumes, dialogue. We create all these instantaneously through our thought processes. And that's the training wheels for learning to do that in real life. But only an avatar or enlightened being is safe to do that. Because the rest of us have so many unconscious, non-deliberate thoughts that if every one of these thoughts were to be immediately manifested, our freeways would be littered with dead bodies. Every time somebody cut you off and you showered out of the wind at him, there'd be a dead person at the end of that roadway. So to protect us against that, there's the law of deferred outcome. Eventually, we get to a place where we can manifest instantly because we're operating totally out of love. And there are no victims from that. There are only people who are being healed by that. So the results then, in a sense that all of these laws interact with each other. And they apply whether we know them or we don't know them. In the same way that the law of gravity applies whether you know it or you don't know it. If you're a little child who hasn't understood the law of gravity and you climb onto the veranda on the 3rd floor of an apartment building and you crawl through the bars and you fall, you're going to get killed. Whether or not you were aware that there was a law called the law of gravity. And whether or not we're aware that there are laws called cosmic laws, we are subject to the results of them. So the journey of incarnation and the journey of enlightenment is to become aware of those laws and to begin to apply them in our lives. So being awake, being enlightened simply means knowing those, not just at an intellectual level, but at a deep, deep level. And this then is what I mean by the Cosmic Ascension Project. Thanks, guys. That's brilliant. And so there's a condition called the idiot savant. You're aware of that? And sometimes autistic kids seem to suffer from that. And what seems to be true is that somehow that there's a mechanism which is turned off by brain trauma or in the minds of autistic kids. And it's a filtering mechanism. So most of us can only operate in life by filtering out, massive amounts of data from the universe. We're so bombarded constantly with data through our sensorium and through our other faculties that the conscious brain cannot handle it. And so it's like a defense mechanism so that we don't get overwhelmed. We filter out a whole bunch of stuff. And all of us do it. You know, I used the example, yesterday is, if you say to me, what do you see outside your window? If I look outside my window, I see that there's a fog around at the moment, but I can see the mountain in the background. I can see redwood trees. I can see madrona trees. I can see manzanita trees. I can see the deck, but there's so much stuff coming in that I have to try to focus. So I've just mentioned 4 or 5 things that I'm aware of, but I'm actually seeing a whole lot more. But I filtered that out. Otherwise, I would be overwhelmed. Now, the ego, in order to not get overwhelmed, has to protect itself by, filtering out a whole bunch of stuff. Autistic kids and people after brain trauma somehow lose that filtering mechanism. So there are data coming through which are not available to the rest of us. So you take, for instance, an idiot savant, and there's such a person there, who was tested, and he was asked to see how many places of decimals he could calculate pi. Pi is an irrational number, which it repeats infinitely. There's no way of estimating. There's no formula for predicting pi. And this kid, they sat him down, a 20-year-old kid, and he went through 3.141592 and kept going. And he kept going for 20,000, decimal points. And then the scientists had to shut him down and say, okay, guys, we can't go any further. And the kid is reporting, he's just seeing this. He's not calculating this. He's just reading off the numbers he can see. Now, where does that coming from? There was another kid, an idiot savant, not an African-American, he's English, African English, who's an extraordinary artist. And they've taken him in helicopters. One particular one I saw, they took him in a helicopter up over Rome, maybe 2,000 feet over the city of Rome. And they drove around in the helicopter for about maybe 2 or 3 hours, and he's seeing different parts of Rome. And then they bring him down to an artist studio, and they put the entire wall is paper, literally the perimeter of maybe, 100 feet of paper. And over a period of 3 days, he painted the entire skyline of Rome, including high-rises, skyscrapers, with the exact number of windows on each wall of the skyscraper, after a 3-hour journey in a helicopter over the city of Rome. And you begin to ask, how in God's name could that happen? That somehow either autism or traumatic brain injury has a kind of disconnected filtering mechanism or a protective mechanism that guards us from overwhelm, from being in so total contact with the environment that we're literally processing everything. So in answer to your question, very definitely, I think, that we have shut down our capabilities because we're confined to these spacesuits with this tiny little brain that can only manage some stuff. But that even the brain itself, once we remove the filtering systems, are capable of much more than we give them credit for. So that's a great question. So I love how you recapitulated the question from this morning. I love the way you formulated it, and now your own question. And so 2 kind of responses to it. The first one is that everything we say about God is made up. I mentioned this morning at some stage that language itself of its very nature is metaphor. And so when I say to you, I can see a redwood tree right out there. The word redwood tree is a metaphor. It's not the tree. It's a linguistic device whereby I try to confer or share with you an image, so there's a kind of a referent in the real world. There's a signification of it in my mind. I have a mental image of it, and now I'm trying to communicate it to you. But in order to do that, I have to create a metaphor, and the metaphor I use is redwood tree. So every word, in fact, is a metaphor in a reality, which we're trying to articulate and share. But then you can take groups of words and form phrases that create allegories or a second tier of metaphor. And so the question this morning was, I think it came from Bonnie, whether or not my notion of a preconception contract is a metaphor or I believe it's real. And what I said was that it's a metaphor in the sense that it's an articulation of a reality which is beyond language. So on that level, it is a metaphor. But in the second tier, it's not an allegory. I'm not using allegory when I make this, claim or have this cosmology. That is my experience. So it's much my experience as I'm experiencing a redwood tree out there. But the redwood, is a metaphor for the reality of what's actually there. And my languaging is a metaphor, for what's really there. And what's really there is the cosmology. So the same thing now is true about God. When we talk about God, then we are trying to force metaphors in both senses of the word, on what is an ineffable reality. So for us even to ascribe being to God, even the notion of being is a human category. And in some senses, it's meaningless. It's our effort to create a metaphor to try to articulate what we can experience. And then we assign other kinds of categories to God. Like, is it a good God? Is it an angry God? Was this a good thing or a bad thing? Again, those are kind of the overlay of templates on the raw data of the actual experiences. And we're forcing them to conform to particular kinds of templates. If you say to me now, what temperature is it? And I say, it's, I'm going to make it up, 17 degrees. You say, oh my God almighty, it must be really freezing up where you are. And I said to you, actually, I was using centigrade. So if you know that I was using centigrade, you would have a totally different understanding of the temperature here than if I were using Fahrenheit. 17 centigrade is way, way, way below freezing. And so basically, when we talk about God, we're putting templates and categories over our experiences. And depending on the template we use, we're forcing a different kind of version of God to come through. So is it a good God or is it a bad God? Is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? Is there evil in the world or not evil in the world? And so, again, Shakespeare was said, there is nothing either good nor bad. But thinking makes it so. It's our thinking that creates these categories. And Rumi will say, out beyond ideas of right doing and of wrongdoing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. And Jesus says, do not judge. Do not create categories. Particularly when we talk about God, do not create categories. But we're forced to do it in order to kind of try to explain the experiences we have. But you are absolutely right that the experience of whatever this mystery is, that once we embrace the experience of incarnation and we respond to it with a loving heart, ultimately the destiny of that process is union with the mystery. And the mystery, maybe the one thing I want to say about it, and again, that's the attribution of a category, is that this is total love. But your question is brilliant, and your articulation of this morning was brilliant. It's a great question. So the first thing is we have to understand what we mean by miracle. And for most of us, miracle seems to be the belief that God temporarily sets aside cosmic laws in order to indulge the prayers of particular holy people.
Yeah.
I don't believe, if that's what we mean by miracle, I don't believe in miracle. What I understand by miracle is that as human beings, we have an extraordinarily impoverished understanding of the universe and its cosmic laws. When you get a person like a Jesus figure who understands the cosmos at a far deeper level than us, then they're able to work with the tools of the universe in a completely different fashion from the rest of us. So did Jesus really walk in water? Yes. Did Jesus turn water into wine? Yes. Did Jesus resurrect from the dead? Yes, in my opinion, because Jesus had a knowledge of cosmic laws, which is a way above what I have, or most of us have. And so he's able to utilize what's already there. He recognizes what's there and he utilizes what's there. And the rest of us, believe in a totally impoverished version. And so we're shocked when a miracle happens and we think, why did God do this? And why didn't he do it for somebody else? So then what's the point of miracles? If that's the mechanism of how miracles actually happen, in my understanding of it, what is the point of praying to Jesus for protection? It's the same way that, any little child runs to a parental figure in a moment of crisis or danger. In the presence of existential angst, we're constantly looking for avatar figures in our lives, whether they're actually present physically at the moment to us or whether they're at the other side of the veil. Because it doesn't matter a damn what side of the veil they're at. Whether they're saints or avatars or my dead great-grandmother or Jesus or Mary of Magdala, it doesn't matter to them. The veil is meaningless as far as those beings are concerned. And so we're constantly going to run for guidance and protection to people who are further along the path and who are more resourced than we are. And so prayer then and seeking protection from these beings makes absolute sense when we understand who they are, who we are, and what a miracle means. So the first question is about the bodhisattva. And you're absolutely right. At some stage, every soul, until there's the last one standing, every soul is going to, at some stage, realize that salvation consists in everybody coming awake. But some souls are going to take a lot more time to do that. And some souls will not want to leave, the presence of God in order to come back into this veil of tears. So they may have to be there. No, the good news is there is no such thing as time. When we step through the veil, there is no such thing as time. So in one sense, it may take a long, long, long period before they get to the place where love overcomes selfishness. But the truth is, since there is no time, it's instantaneous. So yes, every single soul will take a bodhisattva vow until the last one standing, is left somewhere in some dimension, still not awake. And once that being awakes, there's no need for any soul to make a bodhisattva vow subsequently. So that's your first question. The second question then about, how our mindset, creates our reality and how we choose to make interventions. Now, every one of us, as we look at the world in which we find ourselves, we're players on a team. On the football team, not everybody is Joe Montana. And not everybody is, the wide receiver. We're all playing different roles. And that's the essence of being on a team. And in each incarnation, we're in different positions in the team until we experience all of the positions of the team. And so it means in this incarnation, we have a world situation that we need to do something about. And so there are various ways of influencing the outcome. And there are some people who will attempt to do that through the political process. And there are some people who will do that through joining volunteer movements. And there are some people who will choose to do that by being hermits in Himalayas. And there are some people who will choose to do that, by being members of spiritual communities. But I guarantee you, for any of these people, the only ones among them who are going to affect a good outcome are the people who are operating either mostly or completely out of love. And I don't care what place of the team they're playing. If they're not operating out of love and forgiveness, they're not assisting this process. So you then as an individual person have to decide, okay, how am I going to make a difference, in the world in which I find myself? And only you can decide what your place on the team is. But whatever place you are in the team, I guarantee you, you will only affect a good outcome by being good. You cannot affect a good outcome by being angry or reactionary or unforgiving. So how would the ascension process alter biology? Epigenesis is the modern science that tells us that we are not victims of our genes, that genes are just the building blocks of the form, the physical form, the organism, or skeletal system, or cardiovascular system, or whatever. But if you give a child a bunch of building blocks, there's no predetermined outcome as to how he's going to arrange the building blocks. He may decide to build a skyscraper out of it, or a motorboat out of it, or a car out of it. So these are just, blocks that can be configured in any way. And so the genes are simply building blocks. Epigenesis is the decision, the decision to place the blueprint, the blocks in particular kinds of combinations. And then that's what creates, different outcomes, even biologically, and different outcomes when you're faced with different kinds of illnesses. So we have a lot more power in us, than we're given credit for. And that's why a few Sundays ago, when I spoke about healing modalities, and I talked about my own understanding, my own model of illness and healing, is that it's 6 factors. It's, genes, the building blocks. It's environmental influence. It's personal lifestyle. It's personal mindset. It's a karma, and it's the bodhisattva vow. So epigenesis involves literally the last 4 stages of that. Epigenesis is how I live. Epigenesis is how I think. Epigenesis is the vow I made to come back. Epigenesis is the karmic residue of what I still need to learn. That was the decision by the soul, you know, to alter. And in that process, it literally altered the biology of the incarnational vehicle in which I find myself. So this becomes hugely important then, that in the evolutionary trajectory of both the individual soul and the cosmic, as we alter our biology, we alter our capabilities during incarnation. And as we do that, we either become more capable beings by being loving in our epigenesis, or we become more destructive if our epigenesis involves angry, destructive thinking. But it literally will even affect our physicality, literally. So what I would like to do then is, for the last 5 minutes, is I thought about how I wanted to kind of just end this series of lectures. And this was just during the lunchtime. And I came up with a few ideas. And some of them have to do with just acknowledging what has happened during these 3 days. And the first, you know, great proclamation of gratitude is to all of you. I don't know how many people attended over the 6 days, but I know that all of you made sacrifices in order to be a part of this community of the retreat. There was a lot of other stuff you could have been involved with, and you chose to be involved, you know, with this process. And so I am deeply grateful for you, for your time, for your energy, and for the thought that you've put into this and that you've created for all of us in this community. During the lunch break today, I received a few emails. And one of the emails said that, you know, I have given so much information so quickly that it's very difficult sometimes to follow along. And it is, because I had just 6 lectures to kind of cram a lifetime's of cosmological thinking. And so I just wanted to say to you that all of this material will be uploaded. These lectures will become available and sent out to everybody who joined the retreat, and it will subsequently go up on the website. So it's available for anybody who accesses the website. And for that website, I want to say I'm really, really grateful to Lorraine Moore and to Kenny. They're the people over years and years and years who've made this stuff available on the website for anybody who kind of happens upon it or is interested in it. And all that material will be available. And so if there's been too much information to process as I'm going through it, you can take any one of those videos and, you know, stop at any stage you want. And if you want to think about it or take notes, if that's important to you. And so you get as many chances as you want to kind of process whatever material is important to you. I want to offer a huge note of gratitude to David Carkeek, my dear friend David Carkeek, who for many, many years, for years when I was saying Friday Mass and Saturday Mass every week down in Palo Alto, David came with his camera, he videotaped it, and then he uploaded that. It's Friday and Saturday and Sunday, week after week after week after week, you know, year after year after year after year. And is still doing that on Sundays for us in COJ. And was the IT guy, the go-to guy during this retreat. And together with Karen, I mentioned Karen obviously last, together with Karen has decided that they're going to go through the 6 lectures and all of the questions and try to synthesize the questions, because we don't have release forms from any of you. And so we don't have your permission to put that out in public, your faces or your voices. And so they've offered to kind of synopsize the questions that have come from all of you and to represent that in visual form in a question, and also have one of them speak it, so that if you're listening to this as a podcast, you still have access to the questions. And so I am eternally grateful to David that he's signing up to do a lot of more work when this retreat ends, behind the scenes, that I won't be aware of and you won't be aware of, but that will take a lot of David's time and a lot of David's expertise, because the process of uploading a video is a fairly, I have no idea how to do it, how to edit the material and how to render it and how to put it up on YouTube. I have no idea how to do that, any of that. David will do that after this retreat and has done it for years and years and years. And obviously, you know, the major gratitude, Karen, to you. You're an extraordinary woman, and you have been an extraordinary, you know, resource for us in COJ since you joined this community years and many years ago. This retreat was Karen's brainchild in its initial kind of articulation in Bishop's Ranch, and now online. She's the one who was literally conceived and carried and birthed and nurtured this process over the last 3 days. She went to the extent of learning how to use Zoom as a hostess in order to make this happen. I don't know how to do that. I couldn't do that. Karen has been doing this. And so I am really deeply grateful to you, Karen, for all of the work that went into creating this, you know, and running it, nurturing it, and what you will continue to do with David to kind of deliver the end product to all of us. And finally, I want to say this. I'm pretty exhausted at this stage, but I'll be doing the Mass next Sunday, God willing. And normally on a Sunday, what I do is I spend a lot of time thinking about a possible homily, trying to get my thoughts straight about it, creating kinds of an outline in my own mind, what I want to talk to, and then delivering it. And then the part I like best actually is the Q&A at the end of it. Because I know that when I'm speaking, when I'm delivering a homily, I'm talking about stuff that's important to me. When I'm responding to a question or an input, I'm responding to something which is important to somebody else. And so that's actually the part that I really love. But last Sunday, I didn't get an opportunity to do that because I was exhausted and I was in the middle of preparation for this retreat. And so my plan next Sunday is this. I'm planning not to give a homily next Sunday. I'm planning instead to devote the entire period that would have normally been a homily and a Q&A and discussion to a Q&A and discussion. And for the material for that is anything that's come up during this retreat and anything that you can salvage from the homilies I've given in 2020. And to make that very easy for you, over the next 1 or 2 days, I'm going to create an outline, a one-paragraph synopsis of each of the homilies I've given in 2020. And that's a synopsis I give to David Carkeek every Sunday evening, which synopsizes the homily. And David puts that up under the homily itself. So you read this blurb that David has put up. So I have actually a list of all those blurbs for 2020. And it's in its current form, it's in 14-point double spacing, you know. And so although it's 10 pages, it's you read it through in about 3 or 4 minutes. So I'm hoping to give that to Karen, you know, and to Lawrence, so that that material can be sent out over the next day or two. And if you choose to read the synopsis, it'll familiarize yourself with the content of all of the homilies in 2020. And you who've been present in the retreat will realize, you know, that you've heard this material once already. So on the basis of that, I'm planning then to do a full hour of Q&A and suggestions to deal with all the material we've covered in the retreat and all of the material that I've covered in 2020. And in that fashion, I'm hoping that we can, as a community, we can help each other on this extraordinary journey for which we volunteered long before our grandparents had faces. So, namaste, guys.
So I want to speak for everyone, to thank you, Sean, for these incredible lectures that are so rich and so deep and give us so much to think about. And like I was saying before to you, they ring like a clear bell. They have a coherence that is extraordinary. I've been to many retreats that you've given, and each time it seems to just, the tone, the sound that it's making becomes clearer and clearer. And you're just such a gift to all of us. And we're just deeply grateful.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, my brothers and sisters. Big hug to you. E-hug. Namaste.
Namaste.
God bless you.